I'm Maria Fontanazza with MedAd News, and I'm here with Jimmy Driscoll and Aimee Turner of Moonrabbit. Jimmy, tell me what inspired your decision to root the agency's philosophy in intimacy, and talk a little bit about how this has evolved over time.
Yeah, when we started the agency, we really looked at the people that we had, and we had this really nice blend of cross geography, cross cultural people. And we landed on Proudly Misfit, which is allowing people to be themselves and really celebrating individuality. We always wanted it to be a destination where creatives could come and be their most creative, where strategy and media would look at things a little bit differently than everybody else. So we started really thinking about what was really deeply personal and what was really rooted in that belief. And we landed on intimacy as something that really was an umbrella strategy that went across the agency.
And what role does intimacy play within the agency culture?
Yeah, so the agency culture, I would much rather have somebody who's curious and collaborative than somebody who has a pristine resume that looks like they're, look the part, but might not fit what we want. So that continuous idea of collaboration and curiosity is something that drives everybody here and drives our culture. And that really defines who we are. It's a little bit different than just like, a sheet that you get that has core responsibilities and goals. It's something that we really live and breathe.
So let's get into some nuts and bolts now. I see Aimee's eyes lighting up. We're going to talk about media integration and experience design. So how does your definition of intimacy shape media planning and the placement decisions that you're making?
It changes the way that we look at the entire approach. We don't begin with an RFP. And I think that's something that is very different for the people that we hire that do come from industry, because they're normally set in a certain process in the way that they operate and the way that they do things. But from a media perspective, when we think about intimacy, I want to think about the plan surrounding that person and that disease state first. And sometimes that's led to us creating tactics that don't even exist in the landscape, because we're thinking about how would we want to reach that person in the right way, instead of what is this vendor offering? How many tactics can they pass back that might fit the mold that I'm trying to force it into? So when I think about intimacy and planning, it's taking away everything that anyone is really used to from the process, saying, hey, let's think about the goal first. Who we're reaching, how do we want to reach them, with what, and why? And then let's figure out how we do that with our vendors. And sometimes that's creating something that's bespoke and brand new. And that's what makes us different too, because we're able to do that for our partners to create new opportunities for other brands, but also for our brands to be sometimes not just the first to market, but the first to reach someone in a unique way too.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about how you build a plan for the year for a brand. A lot of times when you see like a scope of work, there's already tactics populated. It's like, well, we haven't had a discussion yet about like what the goals are. Like, the marketing goals and the brand goals, but there's not a deeper dive into understanding who the audience is. So when you start to do that, and I do think this is a differentiator for us, you start to eliminate what your traditional block and tackle tactics might be and replace them with tactics that people may have not done before. Something new that hasn't been done, needs a proof of concept, but it's right for the brand and right for that specific moment.
Yeah. And actually, when I look about planning from a timeline perspective, I'll plan for 1 quarter, and that's it. I'll use the rest of my SOW and flex funds because I'm looking at what's performing best against my audience in the market and having the ability to infinitely adjust and be nimble in the way that we activate, which is totally different from my big pharma experience that needs to know, a half a year to a year in advance what we're buying. We say, no, we're going to take a look at, see what's working and see where we need to pivot. We're going to do so from the very get-go in the beginning and the core of the way that we approach media.
Yeah, and how media intersects with design is really interesting because we like to look at that same sort of lens that Aimee puts on it and build things that are modular and fluid so we can adapt as she's beginning to flex. And it's not your same old stale sort of tactics that you see all the time.
Mm-hmm. Aimee, you touched a bit on this in talking about the media landscape. It's increasingly becoming fragmented. So how are you designing moments that feel more personal and connected?
We try to build bespoke. I think that's really important when we're looking at our media and our measurement strategy, as well as the way that we approach creative, is I want to reach that individual in a moment with a message that matters. And that's way more difficult than I think everyone thinks when they say that. It's understanding different levels of audiences, what that individual as a human being and as a person connects with. And that might look different across so many different demographics and geographies and types of tactics. And so we get really, really granular when we media plan to make sure that what we look at when we look at projection analysis and conversion to brand is filling that funnel and filling it across every touch point in that audience that matters. And a lot of that starts with the message and how that feels to the individual.
And Jimmy, how early in the process do your media and creative teams collaborate, and how does that change the outcomes?
As early as possible.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it changes the outcome, but Aimee touched on the human element of it. And it's always interesting whenever we're starting a project. The first question I ask is like, who is this for? Like, why are we doing this? How do we want them to interact? And then what's the action you want someone to take? And what Aimee's team does is really provide all that behavioral analysis upfront and the data of like how someone's going to interact with something. When you're in a room and you're have an agency and marketer dynamic, you forget that none of us are the end user. None of us are going to be using this properly. We might test it, we might look at it, but it's not us that we're building this for. So you always have to keep in your back of your mind, there's HCPs, there's patients, but they're all people. So understanding the human element is super important. So the sooner we could have them be part of that process, the easier it is. It's always easier to get as much information up front and call that down. I like to use the squiggle of design as like my way of doing that, where like just get as much information as possible and then distill that down to what we want the core message to be. And without that information, you can't do that. So I don't want to leave any stone unturned when we start talking about framing out experiences, because media is your first touch point. That's what your first interaction is going to be your driver, but ultimately you have to pay that off for a brand experience. And it's really important that the two work together to marry that. And so there's a consistency that you develop.
Yeah, and I've learned a lot from working so closely with the creative side of the business. I came from a big holding company agency that said, we're all under one roof, but we weren't. We technically were in the same building, but I had no idea what side of that business did. And so coming here, I've learned a ton from the way that we approach creative and pulled that through into the way that we activate media. So for example, when we talk about HCP interviews, when we're talking about messaging and positioning, I'll ask them what podcasts they listen to. I'll be a part of that interview and to understand their media and consumption behavior habits too. And sometimes that's led to some really cool buys and some really cool executions, because I heard that a surgeon doesn't bother paying for Spotify Premium because he has to log in every time he goes to the OR. So he's listening to ad service music because he's too annoyed at the login system to get music when he's doing a surgery. And that matters because I can reach them in a moment where they might be actually caring for a patient that has something that they're dealing with and something that our brands are looking to influence. So it's been really interesting the way that we've integrated. I'd say that we've come up with some really innovative solutions to the way that we approach both sides because of our ability and capability of working together.
Someone recently asked me, like, why is your media division different than another company's? I said, well, first of all, we put them with creatives. It's not a separate unit that just gets assets and is, going to tell the team where they're going to place them. They actually interact throughout the process to really understand like what the purpose is and what we're doing. It's a very integrated approach, which is definitely different from the way a lot of people approach.
Expand on that a little bit. So how do you ensure that the media choices are amplifying the intimacy message rather than diluting it?
The nitty-gritty detail.
Yeah.
So I think I spoke about this a little bit prior with Lauren from a brand strategy perspective, but I never want to over-optimize my campaigns towards a metric that I don't even know will potentially lead to a conversion. I really want to get to the core root of the message and understand that I reach that individual with that message first and change a behavior pattern. And I'll evaluate that through tons of different metrics that will flow into a measurement plan. But what I really look at when I think about activating and intimacy is my team is fast and nimble and used to looking at data. What we've learned so much from the creative side is how to consider the person in that thought process. How do we make a pivot that might resonate with an audience? And maybe there's a data point that you don't have that could help inform that. How do we fill that gap? But how do we make that a part of our consideration process when we're looking at changing campaigns and pivoting media?
Yeah, and the great thing about what Aimee just said is digital is the one true form that you could actually monitor in real time. and make adjustments as it's going. So subsegments might come out of our original segmented audience, and bespoke assets might be created based on what we're seeing in data. But that really helps redefine everything we're doing from an omnichannel standpoint.
Mm-hmm. And from an activation standpoint, when we talk about audiences, most people are thinking about only the diagnosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I want to know who the mom is. I want to know the caretaker. I want to know their best friend, because I have a best friend with, unfortunately, a pretty serious illness. And the first thing that I'm doing is looking for solutions for her. So if I'm a point of influence on her decision making, I want to be able to reach that person with the appropriate amount of information too. So considering them as a human and all of their points and touch points in their life, and being able to reach a media plan that actually has legs outside of that individual diagnosis code that we're targeting, I think has made a really big impact on our outcomes and what we deliver to clients.
Can you share an example of a media activation where the audience felt seen or understood?
Yeah, so we actually go into groups, if allowed permission, on Facebook, and we monitor what the conversations are about the disease state and how they feel about it. We just started working on a muscular degenerative disease, and one of the key components that they were discussing was, how do I ensure my child can pick up a spoon and feel independent when they're eating? And they were discussing all these different Amazon purchases that they had made and modifications to things that are already existing. And what that told me is, okay, I know that this is not a highly purchased material on Amazon. So the people that are in these groups, the people that are likely purchasing this, probably have a loved one with this disease state because they're looking to make modifications. So now I know I can buy against that purchasing behavior as opposed to their diagnosis codes, and reach someone who's actually going to be interacting with a likely patient. And that's huge, because when we talk about HIPAA compliance and audience buying and making sure you're reaching the right person, that's a key insight that we were able to generate from those conversations and listening that allowed us to reach an audience and buy against it at probably the highest audience quality that we'll see in our campaign.
And so how do you see the role of intimacy evolving as tech and personalization continue to accelerate?
Yeah, I think you're seeing it in real time right now, the acceleration of moving from what's physical and emotional to more contextual and data driven. And it's kind of redefining that relationship. As I say that out loud, I think about like my kids who have grown up in a mobile social world. And I wonder, when they define intimacy later, will like the human quality of that kind of be stripped out of how they define it. But I think ultimately, the one thing that is always going to come true is the brands that are able to capitalize on those moments of intent and deliver on authenticity are always going to resonate more than brands that are just like showing algorithmic precision.
And a lot of our competitors are doing that algorithmic precision, and we're outperforming them.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks volumes about the way that we approach our campaigns and our creative.
So talk a little bit about that. How do you preserve the authenticity when you're scaling this approach across different audiences and different markets?
It's a lot of
I got a lot to say about it too. But no, I think when you look at AI and just like algorithms in general, like I said before, they're redefining what the experience is like. And I think we have a responsibility as marketers to be very targeted with how we go after our audience. And what I mean by that is we need to look at people, not just lists or segments, and really have a true understanding. Just because I like a band doesn't mean I like the genre. So like really understanding what my needs are and capitalizing on that is going to be important. So intention becomes sort of the currency of keeping that authenticity and intimacy going, and really providing content that means something to me, because Aimee and her team have done enough to really understand like what my needs are and where those moments of intent are, rather than just having me be part of a list that they purchased because I got jammed into a lookalike segment.
Very true.